a secret, buried for decades in the isolated depths of the Ozark Mountains, within a community as cut off as the souls who inhabited it, began with her. She ran away from her father, already pregnant with him. This is the narrative of Martha Holloway, a young woman whose destiny, on a family line where kinship boundaries had been blurred for generations, was sealed even before her own birth. The Holloway Clearing, 1952. Our account starts in 1952, a time when the Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri were home to hundreds of secluded communities, many of which were virtually unconnected to the modernizing rest of America. Roughly 40 kilometers from the town of Branson, in one of these forgotten valleys, lay a property known locally as the Holloway Clearing. For 3 generations, the Holloway family had carved out a practically self-sufficient existence on this 200-acre property, with minimal interaction with the outside world. Samuel Holloway, a 43-year-old man, led the property. He had been a widower for 5 years, following the death of his wife Elizabeth during the birth of their 6th son, who also didn't survive. Rare visitors described Samuel as an imposing figure, with a thick beard and grey eyes that seldom betrayed emotion. His word was law on the property where he lived with his 5 surviving children. What few realized was that the Holloway family was already carrying the heavy burden of several generations of intermarriage between cousins. Samuel himself, like his late wife, was the son of first cousins. This practice, which began in the 19th century during the region's colonization as a way to keep land and assets within the family, had morphed into a rarely questioned custom, even as signs of genetic problems started to appear. Among Samuel's children, 17-year-old Martha, the eldest, was perceived as the healthiest and most beautiful. Martha was small in stature, with long brown hair and deep blue eyes contrasting with light skin, and exhibited a vitality and intelligence that seemed to have sidestepped the genetic fate beginning to show in her younger siblings. John, 14, had severe learning difficulties. Thomas, 12, suffered from a spinal malformation that restricted his movement. Rebecca, 10, appeared normal but spoke infrequently, and the youngest, Elijah, 8, was born with fused fingers, a condition limiting his dexterity. The family's isolation was not merely geographical, but also social and cultural. The Holloway children were educated at home, taught by Samuel, who had an education equivalent to high school. The practiced religion was a version of Christianity, with Samuel acting as the supreme interpreter of Scripture. Contact with the outside world was restricted to Samuel's monthly trips to town for supplies they couldn't produce, and occasional family visits to the local church for Christmas and Easter. The glimpse and the disappearance. However, this isolated equilibrium was shattered in April 1952 when Reverend Robert McKinther, the local minister, managed to convince Samuel to permit Martha to participate in the church's youth activities, arguing the young woman needed appropriate female companionship for her age. Samuel reluctantly agreed, perhaps respecting religious authority, or possibly seeing Martha as a potential link to a respectable family in the area that could open new doors. For the next 2 months, Martha experienced her first taste of the world beyond the Holloway property. During Sunday activities, she met other young women, learned songs, attended picnics, and, most crucially, was introduced to values and ideas different from those imposed by her father. These interactions led Martha to begin realizing there was something deeply troubling about her own family. In June 1952, Martha confided in Sarah Bennett, the Reverend's wife, about a persistent anxiety. "Sometimes when my dad comes back from town, he looks at me in a way that gives me goosebumps," Martha shared. "It's like he's looking at me, but not as a daughter." Alarmed, Sarah inquired if Samuel had acted inappropriately, to which Martha responded only with tears and silence. Sarah promised to discuss the matter with the Reverend. The following Sunday, however, Samuel announced that Martha could no longer attend church activities, citing her many responsibilities at home. When Reverend McKinther visited the property to try and intervene, he was met with a shotgun and ordered never to set foot on Holloway land again. In the weeks that followed, nearby neighbors reported hearing shouting from the Holloway property at night. In mid-July, the nearest neighbor's eldest son, while hunting, saw Martha doing laundry alone at the stream that bordered the property. He noticed bruises on her arms and a dejected demeanor, a sharp contrast to the liveliness she'd shown at church events. Late in July, during a particularly violent storm, Martha Holloway vanished from the family property. Samuel Holloway appeared in town the next morning, visibly distraught, asking if anyone had seen his daughter. An unofficial search was mounted, but no sign of Martha was found in the vicinity. Samuel publicly accused Reverend McKinther of filling the girl's head with dangerous ideas and potentially aiding her escape, accusations the minister vehemently denied. The revelation and the custody battle. The truth began to surface only 2 weeks later when Martha was found unconscious on the side of a road more than 80 kilometers away, outside Springfield. She was rushed to the local hospital, dehydrated, malnourished, and, as doctors soon discovered, approximately 2 months pregnant. When Martha Holloway regained consciousness at the Springfield Hospital in August 1952, she initially refused to give any information beyond her name. Eleanor Thompson, the 37-year-old social worker assigned to the case, known for her compassion and patience, spent days building trust with the traumatized young woman. Martha was like an injured animal, Eleanor would recall years later in her personal diary, made public in 1998 after her death. Her eyes were constantly scanning for danger. She flinched at the smallest noise. It took a week before she let me sit beside her bed without trembling. Meanwhile, authorities identified Martha's family through fragmented school records and the Reverend McKinther's testimony. Upon learning of his daughter's whereabouts, Samuel Holloway immediately demanded her release and return to his custody, citing his right as her legal guardian and father. It was during the second week of her hospitalization that Martha finally began to tell her story to Eleanor, in accounts interspersed with long silences and crying fits. Martha revealed the horror of the months preceding her escape. "After I stopped going to church, Dad started locking me in the basement when visitors came," Martha confided. "He told my brothers I was sick at night, after everyone slept." At this juncture, as Eleanor noted, Martha frequently paused, unable to verbalize the events. Over the next few days, the full picture emerged. Samuel had begun visiting Martha's room at night, initially just to observe her. According to the young woman, these episodes escalated into forced intimate contacts, always coupled with threats of punishment to her younger siblings if she resisted or spoke out. He said that this was how families kept the blood pure, Martha told the social worker, claiming that her own mother was not only her mother but also her aunt, and that such practices were normal in the mountain families. The most shocking revelation explained her flight that particular July night. "I heard Dad talking to Uncle Jeremiah about marrying me off to my cousin Walter when he got back from the army. Walter is Uncle Jeremiah's son with Aunt Catherine, who was my mother's sister. I knew I would never escape that cycle again." Martha had planned her escape for weeks, hiding small amounts of food and any loose change. On the night of the storm, as the family focused on securing the property from potential flooding, she slipped out her bedroom window with only the clothes on her back and a small bundle of essential belongings. "I walked for days, sleeping in barns and catching rides when I thought it was safe," she recounted. "I just wanted to reach a place where no one knew me, where I could start over." The legal and ethical dilemma. Martha Holloway's case presented the authorities in 1952 with a complex legal and ethical conundrum. On one side were extremely serious accusations against Samuel, which, if substantiated, constituted atrocious crimes. On the other was the social stigma surrounding issues of family intimacy, rarely discussed openly then, especially in conservative rural communities. District Prosecutor Howard Jenkins, a pragmatic, middle-aged man known for his discretion, initially opted for a cautious approach. Rather than immediately filing criminal charges against Samuel Holloway, which would be difficult to prove without physical evidence beyond Martha's testimony, Jenkins requested that Judge William Cuthus issue a temporary protection order, prohibiting Samuel from having any contact with his daughter. Judge Cuthus, a 62-year-old known for his traditional views on family matters, surprised many by not only granting the protection order but also mandating a broader investigation into the living conditions of Samuel Holloway's other children. The allegations made by the minor Martha Holloway are so serious in nature that this court cannot disregard the possibility that other minors residing on the Holloway property may be at risk, the judge wrote in his August 28, 1952 decision. The ensuing investigation uncovered a generational pattern of consanguineous relationships in the Holloway family, dating back at least 4 generations. Birth certificates and parish records documented multiple marriages between first and second-degree cousins, and in at least 2 earlier instances, relationships between uncle and niece had been formalized through fabricated weddings. Dr. Harold Winters, a physician appointed to examine Martha's siblings, documented a host of conditions he attributed to the effects of prolonged consanguinity. The 4 minors exhibit conditions consistent with recurrent genetic issues in consanguineous lineages, including cognitive disabilities, physical malformations, and atypical development. A clear danger for any future offspring, his report stated. While the investigation progressed, Martha remained in state care, initially at the hospital and later at a temporary home run by Catholic nuns near Springfield. It was there, in September 1952, that Martha attempted to end her life after the confirmation of her pregnancy became undeniable. She ingested a significant amount of cleaning product, reported Sister Mary Catherine, the home supervisor. When we found her, she kept repeating that she couldn't bring another deformed creature into the world, that the blood was tainted, and it would be better for everyone if she ended it there. Following the suicide attempt, Martha was transferred to a psychiatric institution in St. Louis for constant observation. Doctors intensely debated the management of the pregnancy. In 1952, intentional termination of pregnancy was not only illegal under most circumstances but also widely considered morally unacceptable, even in extreme cases like Martha's. Dr. Lawrence Friedman, the chief psychiatrist on the case, detailed the ethical dilemma in his notes. The patient is clearly traumatized by the prospect of carrying a pregnancy resulting from improper relations with her own parent. The risk of a further suicide attempt is significant. The patient's immediate psychological well-being may be better served. The trial and the sentence. While Martha struggled with her reality in the psychiatric facility, Samuel Holloway finally faced the legal repercussions of his actions. On October 5, 1952, after weeks of investigation, prosecutor Howard Jenkins filed formal charges against Samuel, including child abuse, parental neglect, and improper conduct under tutelage, legal terms of the era that avoided explicit language about the actual nature of the crimes. The local community reacted with a mix of shock, disbelief, and, in some quarters, defense of the accused. Samuel has always been a reserved man, but hard-working and God-fearing, a neighbor told the local newspaper. These accusations must be a misunderstanding. Others, particularly women in the community, expressed that they had always sensed something disturbing in the Holloway family dynamics. Those children never smiled, remarked one church woman. And Martha, when she started coming on Sundays, looked like a flower blooming in the sun for the first time. There was a hunger in her eyes, not for food, but for something she never had. The winter of 1952 to 1953 was particularly severe in the Ozark Mountains. As snow blanketed the hills and valleys, further isolating rural communities, 3 concurrent dramas unfolded involving the Holloway family members. At the St. Louis Psychiatric Institution, Martha Holloway, now 17 years old and 4 months pregnant, cycled between periods of profound depression and unexpected moments of determination and clarity. The medical team had stabilized her emotional state enough that she no longer posed an immediate danger to herself, but the underlying trauma remained virtually untouched. During therapy sessions, Martha began to express concern not only for her own future but also for the fate of her brothers, Dr. Friedman noted in January 1953. It is remarkable how, despite everything she endured, she maintains a strong sense of responsibility for the younger children. Dr. Elalina Blackwell, one of the few female psychiatrists practicing in Missouri at the time, gradually assumed leadership in Martha's treatment. Under her care, the young woman started to process her trauma through art and occupational therapy, activities considered innovative for the era. Martha displays a remarkable aptitude for drawing, Dr. Blackwell observed. Her initial drawings depicted exclusively claustrophobic scenes, dark basements, locked windows, dense, dead forests. In recent weeks, however, images of open doors and paths stretching to the horizon have begun to appear. In mid-January, a significant breakthrough occurred when Martha, for the first time, voiced curiosity about the development of the baby she was carrying. She asked if the child was guaranteed to be born with problems, if there was any chance it could be normal, despite the circumstances of its conception, Dr. Blackwell reported. I explained as compassionately and honestly as possible that while the risk of genetic complications was higher due to consanguinity, it was not an absolute certainty. While Martha slowly pieced together a sense of hope in St. Louis, the situation of her siblings had become a matter of intense social and legal debate. Following Samuel Holloway's arrest, the 4 minors were temporarily placed with different foster families, a decision the Child Welfare Department justified as necessary to properly assess each child's specific needs. The children's adjustment to these new environments was, predictably, challenging. The minors show behaviors consistent with prolonged social isolation and exposure to traumatic family dynamics, social worker Marian Hendris noted in her December 1952 follow-up report. Particularly noteworthy is the tendency of the 4 siblings to communicate with each other through gestures and expressions that seem to form their own language, possibly developed as a protective mechanism. Rebecca, the 10-year-old sister who rarely spoke, astonished everyone when, after 6 weeks at the McIntyre's house, she started communicating verbally, not with adults, but with the Reverend's daughter, a girl her own age. Mrs. McIntyre reported hearing the girls talking in their shared room, with Rebecca describing in disturbing detail the special games her father made Martha play when he thought the other children were asleep. These further disclosures, though relayed through a child's indirect witness, served to strengthen the case against Samuel Holloway, whose trial was set for March 1953. Samuel, meanwhile, remained in county jail, denying any wrongdoing and insisting his family practices were protected by his religious freedom and a father's natural right to rule his own home. He found an unlikely ally in his state-appointed attorney, Clayton Morris, a deeply religious man who, while personally appalled by the accusations, firmly believed in the constitutional right of defense for all accused. My client categorically denies the allegations presented and maintains that his actions have always been guided by his family's welfare, Morris told the local press. We question the reliability of an emotionally disturbed teenager's testimony and the legality of how the children were removed from the family residence. The third drama unfolded on the abandoned Holloway property, which was under continuous investigation. In January 1953, during a thorough search of the premises, authorities discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floor of the main house, containing family documents dating back to 1865. Among these was a diary belonging to Josiah Holloway, Samuel's great-grandfather and the original family patriarch in the region. The diary entries, written between 1865 and 1883, revealed a disturbing philosophy that had apparently guided family practices for generations. The world outside is corrupt, but we Holloways will keep our blood pure, Josiah wrote in 1872. Every union with strangers dilutes our essence. Every marriage within the family strengthens our legacy. This is how we survive when others fail. Other entries described how Josiah had gradually isolated his family from the wider community, establishing a belief system that blended distorted biblical interpretations with popular pseudoscientific theories of the late 19th century. A particularly telling entry, dated 1879, described how Josiah had arranged the marriage of his eldest daughter, then 14, to his own younger brother, the girl's uncle. Elizabeth initially resisted, as expected of her stubborn nature. After 3 weeks in the Healing House basement, she finally accepted the divine will and her responsibility to the purity of our lineage. The discovery of these documents not only provided additional evidence against Samuel but also a broader historical context to understand how abusive practices had endured for generations, masked by a veneer of religious isolation and self-sufficiency. Hope, the verdict, and the future. On March 10, 1953, the trial of Samuel Holloway finally commenced at the county courthouse, an event that drew attention from local residents as well as journalists from Kansas City and St. Louis. The case had gained regional notoriety, not so much for the specific details of the charges, which the newspapers of the time handled with extreme caution and veiled language, but for representing the tension between isolation, family practices, and evolving social and legal standards in the post-war era. Prosecutor Howard Jenkins, aware of the case's sensitivity and the difficulty of securing convictions in matters involving intimate family relations at the time, structured his argument around the most easily provable aspects of Samuel's conduct: the forced isolation of the children, the deprivation of adequate education, the unsanitary conditions of the property found during investigations, and the physical abuse documented by the doctors who examined the minors. Jenkins's strategy was buttressed by expert testimony contextualizing the dangers of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Harold Winters presented medical and photographic evidence of the children's cognitive and physical conditions, which he directly attributed to the detrimental effects of reproduction within a limited gene pool over multiple generations. Dr. Richard Montgomery, a University of Missouri geneticist testifying as an expert witness, explained to the jury how consanguinity significantly amplified the risk of problematic genetic traits manifesting. When closely related people have children, the chances of the child inheriting 2 copies of potentially harmful genes increase significantly. The odds of a negative outcome are much greater. Martha, still heavily pregnant, did not appear in court. Instead, her account was submitted as a pre-recorded deposition taken in the presence of a judge, the prosecutor, and the defense attorney. The decision not to subject the young woman to the added trauma of confronting her father was made on the express recommendation of Dr. Blackwell, who warned that such a confrontation could trigger a severe relapse in Martha's psychological state. Samuel's defense, conversely, focused on undermining the credibility of Martha's testimony and portraying the defendant as a strict but devoted father whose practices of family isolation were motivated by sincere religious convictions and a desire to shield his children from the corrupting influence of modern society. The charges against my client represent nothing less than the criminalization of traditional family practices and religious beliefs that span generations, Clayton Morris argued in his opening statement. Mr. Holloway raised his children the way he believed was right, according to the values passed down by his father and his father's father before him. Morris called several members of the broader Ozark mountain community as witnesses who, while not intimately familiar with the Holloway family, attested that self-sufficiency and family isolation were respected and common practices in the region, and that governmental interference in family affairs was traditionally viewed with suspicion. The most contentious testimony came from Jeremiah Holloway, Samuel's 41-year-old brother and the children's uncle, mentioned in Martha's report as complicit in the plan to marry her to her cousin. Jeremiah, who bore a notable resemblance to Samuel, denied any knowledge of improper behavior by his brother and described the Holloway family as reserved but decent. When questioned by the prosecutor about the documented consanguineous marriages in the family history, including his own marriage to his first-degree cousin Catherine, Jeremiah responded with disturbing candor, "Where I grew up, you marry who you know and who you trust. And who do you know better than your own family? Maybe it seems strange in the city, but in the mountains, it's just the way to survive." The trial lasted 7 days, during which the local community polarized. While the majority expressed horror at the revelations about Holloway practices, a vocal minority defended Samuel's right to raise his family according to his own beliefs, seeing the case as an example of government encroachment on family autonomy, a value deeply cherished by many mountain dwellers. On March 17, 1953, after less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Wilson, after hearing further arguments on sentencing, sentenced Samuel Holloway to 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole until he had served at least 15 years. This court has rarely seen a case of such prolonged and systematic abuse of parental authority, Judge Wilson declared during sentencing. While we acknowledge the rights of parents to raise their children according to their religious convictions, that right finds its absolute limits when it endangers the physical, mental, and moral well-being of the minors under their guardianship. The sentence was met with silent approval by most court attendees, including several members of the local religious community who had initially defended Samuel. Reverend McKinther, who had been present throughout the trial, later remarked that the case had compelled many in the community to confront a darkness they preferred to believe didn't exist among them. As Samuel Holloway was taken to begin his sentence at the state penitentiary, a new chapter unfolded for Martha. On March 26, 1953, at 38 weeks gestation, she went into labor at the St. Louis Hospital, attended by Dr. Blackwell, who had become her protector and confidant. After 14 hours of labor, Martha gave birth to a baby girl who, surprisingly, appeared to have no immediately obvious physical anomalies. Dr. Spencer Reynolds, the examining pediatrician, offered cautious observation: "The child has normal reflexes. All fingers and toes are present and well-formed, and there are no visible signs of cranial or facial abnormalities commonly associated with near consanguinity cases. However, some conditions may only manifest later in development." The child's fate had been intensely debated in the preceding months. Under the normal circumstances of the time, a single teenage mother would be strongly pressured to give the baby up for adoption, especially considering the traumatic conception. However, Dr. Blackwell had passionately argued that forcing Martha to separate from her daughter against her will would constitute an unnecessary additional trauma. Having observed the evolution of Martha's attitude toward the pregnancy, I am convinced that she has formed a genuine bond with the child she is carrying, Dr. Blackwell wrote in her official recommendation to the family court. Separating mother and daughter at this juncture would add another layer of trauma to a young woman who has already endured more than anyone should. With adequate support, I believe Martha is capable of being a loving and competent mother, transforming a tragic circumstance into an opportunity for healing and redemption. Influenced by the respected psychiatrist's recommendation and the unusual precedent of the case, the court granted Martha provisional custody of the newborn, whom she named Hope, a name that reflected her vision for the future. Building a new life. In the weeks following Hope's birth, Martha was moved to a transition house run by a progressive religious organization in Jefferson City. The program, uncommon for the time, was specifically designed to support young mothers in difficult circumstances, offering vocational training, continued education, and housing, allowing the women to retain custody of their children while working toward building independent lives. Martha demonstrates impressive dedication to both her studies and the baby's care, stated Mrs. Patricia Donovan, the program coordinator, in her April 1953 evaluation report. Despite her youth and the traumatic circumstances that brought her to us, she displays notable maturity and determination. Beyond her daughter's well-being, her foremost concern remained the fate of her younger brothers. Indeed, the situation of Martha's siblings had become a complex challenge for the social services system. After months of observation in temporary homes, detailed medical and psychological evaluations were completed for each child, revealing a worrying picture of the effects of prolonged consanguinity and isolation. John, the eldest brother, was diagnosed with moderate intellectual disability which significantly limited his academic learning capacity, though he showed surprising practical aptitude, particularly in woodworking and crafts. Thomas, whose spinal malformation was initially the most visible symptom, also had congenital heart problems requiring corrective surgery. Rebecca, whose reluctance to speak was first attributed to psychological trauma, was diagnosed with a specific form of partial hearing impairment affecting her ability to process certain vocal frequencies. Only Elijah, the youngest, despite the syndactyly fused fingers affecting his hands, appeared to have cognitive development close to normal for his age, though he exhibited significant social backwardness. A case conference held in May 1953 brought together social workers, doctors, specialized educators, and court representatives to determine the long-term future of the Holloway children. The unanimous conclusion was that none of the children could return to the family property, even under the supervision of relatives, an option complicated by the fact that the investigation had implicated virtually all adult Holloway relatives to varying degrees in the system of social insulation and consanguineous marriage. The minors John, Thomas, Rebecca, and Elijah Holloway require levels of specialized medical and educational intervention that would be impossible to guarantee in a conventional family setting in their region of origin, the official report concluded. We recommend permanent placement in institutions that can meet their specific needs, with provisions to maintain contact between the siblings and their older sister, Martha. This recommendation, while formulated with the best intentions and based on professional assessments, reflected the prevalent approach of the time for dealing with children with special needs, institutionalization. Such a decision would be broadly revisited and critiqued in subsequent decades as community integration and deinstitutionality became preferred approaches. But in 1953, it seemed the most responsible course of action available. Martha responded to the news with a blend of determination and resignation. She understands that her brothers need care she cannot provide at the moment, Dr. Blackwell said after informing Martha of the decision, but she made me promise that they would not be forgotten, that they would not disappear into some anonymous system. They had been invisible for far too long, she said. In the ensuing months, as Martha continued her own recovery and adapted to motherhood, she demonstrated extraordinary resilience. She completed the equivalent of high school through an accelerated program, mastered administrative and typing skills, and began to map out a future that had seemed impossible just a year prior. In September 1953, a pivotal moment in the case occurred. I've paraphrased the provided text, altering the word order and sentence structure while preserving the style, tone, and all concrete details and events from the original script. Is there anything else you'd like me to do with this script, or perhaps another one? Tools. Gemini can make mistakes, so double-check it.